Welcome to this lecture on the Cold War division of Germany. Here are some sources that clearly indicate the state that Germany was in 1945. Often this has been known as Year Zero. The meaning behind that clearly means this was starting again. The cities were completely bombed out, the infrastructure was not there, although having said that, not all cities were that badly damaged. Key ones, obviously, places like Leipzig, Dresden and Berlin. Some of the cities, though, in the west had very little bombing. There was the liberation of the camps, both the concentration and the death camps. That caused all sorts of other problems. What was to do with the inmates, what to do with the situation with typhus, disease that was spreading, what to do with the people there that were the perpetrators as opposed to the victims. The large numbers of people moving west, more about that later. Also, people coming in from trying to escape the Red Army. The black market, when basically everything has ended, there is no electricity, gas, water, money does not exist. How do you buy and sell? There are no houses. So the black market is a key element there. Everything was up for sale, and I mean everything. And finally, how do you rebuild? And the rubble women was key to this, the fact that they were the ones who were helping rebuild Germany. What were the Allies to do? Well, before the end of the war, a variety of plans were put forward. One key one was known as the Morgenthau Plan. This was drawn up by the Secretary of State, Henry Morgenthau, and was designed to ensure that Germany would never again be a threat to her neighbours. Basically, they wanted Germany to be broken up into something akin to the state of Germany, say about the 18th century, when it was made up of a variety of smaller independent states. But a new element to this was that higher education was meant to be prohibited and heavy industry destroyed. In other words, to take it back to the Middle Ages, well, even back to the Stone Ages, as some people said. There was a pressure from the public to punish Germany, led to this being adopted as official US and UK policy until the spring of 1945. So how did Germany eventually become divided? Well, a number of conferences were held to start discussing what was going to happen to Germany before the war ended. So the first key one between the big three, Britain, the USSR and America, was held in Tehran in 1943, and there was an agreement that Germany should be divided and occupied. In London in 1944, there was an agreement that there should be 3 zones, which was eventually joined by the French to make up the 4 zones of 1945. At the Potsdam Conference, after the end of the Second World War, or at least the end of the war in Europe, Germany was to be a single economic unit, but administered by zonal commanders meeting in Allied Control Councils. So in other words, it would have its own economy, it would have its own eventually have its own money, but it would be the Allied commanders, the British, the Americans, the French and the USS, the Russians, the Soviets, who would administer this. Officially, this is seen as a temporary situation pending a peace treaty, but de facto consolidation. However, because there was beginning to be factions within the Allies, or at least there was beginning to be distrust between the different allies, especially between the West Allies and the Soviet Union, an economic council appeared in the Western zones, effectively functioning as a proto-government. And basically, it sets up separate currencies, especially in the Western zones, basically the American, the British and the French zones, virtually functioning as a economic, if not a political unit. By May 1949, the Federal Republic of West Germany was announced. Following on from that, in October 1949, the German Democratic Republic, or the East, followed. Both of those joined the respective alliances, the FRG with NATO, the GDR, the Warsaw Pact, and eventually this led to de facto division through the Berlin Wall in 1961. So, what were the Allies aims. They had what were called the 4Ds. Now, what exactly those were, it is up to interpretation. Essentially, you can see here there are 6Ds, and it depends on which of the zones they were in, which was the ones that they focused on most. So one key one was denazification, democratization, although again that would be, it depends on the definition of what democratization would mean, demilitarization, decartelization, which was the breakup of the large-scale industries, dismantlement of the Nazi regime, and decentralization. In February 1945, the big three, as we can see in this photograph, Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin meet in the Soviet Union and establish an Allied Control Commission to govern a defeated Germany. Germany was to be occupied by the three wartime allies and eventually France. Each power was to occupy and administer a zone of its own. The USSR was to retain the territory seized under the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939, and the borders of Poland were to be shifted westwards. And that's important because, in other words, Germany would be made smaller. Its own borders to the west were effectively kept as more or less the same. It was in the east that it was completely changed. Reparations also to be extracted from Germany. And so we can see on this map what was to happen. You have the four zones there. In the east, there was to be the Russian zone, the north, the British zone, in the west, the French zone, towards the south, the American zone. The same thing was to happen to Austria. You can see also the lands that were taken off Germany. East Prussia was to be divided between Poland and the Soviet Union, and the lands up to the Oder-Neisse line, the rivers, were to be given to Poland. Berlin itself, and this is an important thing to remember, Berlin itself was also to be divided into four as well. And that became a key area of tension. You have the French to the north, the British to the west, the Americans to the south, and the Soviets to the east. Later on, when the two Germanys were created in 1949, effectively West Berlin, the three Allied zones, was basically an island completely surrounded by the East Germans. And it's an important thing to remember that. This was a famous speech given by Churchill in 1946, where he said that an iron curtain had effectively come across Europe, and that was due to the fact that the Soviets, once the Red Army had marched through Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, they stayed there. But this was partly an agreement with Stalin as well, between certainly with Roosevelt and Stalin. So, initially you have the four allies fighting on the same side, the Western allies, the British, the French, and the Americans, and then on the eastern side, the Soviets. So how did it get to the stage where they were united and then became divided? Well, the Americans wanted a decentralized federal democratic system in Germany, basically modelled on the US Constitution, and to some extent that is what happens. For Great Britain, Germany, it was more important that Germany becomes denazified and demilitarized, and basically a revival of the economy. And as one historian, Kramer, said, that security from attack, then business as usual. Russia envisaged a united and neutral Germany. This was an important point, that really, to some extent, Stalin didn't want to be in Germany. He wanted his own troops there in the long term. He wanted a united Germany, but one that was completely neutral from the East and the West. The priorities were to consolidate gains in Eastern Europe and extract reparations from Germany. And finally, the French aims were similar to those after World War I. They wanted Germany broken up into weak states that would be no longer a threat to French security, and the creation of a buffer zones in the Rhineland and the Saar. This is a very important map. You can quite clearly see here arrows indicating the large numbers of people on the move, mainly German refugees on the move, after 1940, well, from about 1944 in many cases. The top figures, as you can see in the key towards the bottom left, those are the pre-war populations, the German war losses in those areas, and the German population by 1950. The more green number is the numbers reaching West Germany, and the lesser green number are the numbers of refugees reaching Eastern Germany and Austria. And you can quite often see that many of these are starting to move from, say, Poland, going to East Germany, and then moving on to West Germany after that. And it's from right across Europe. Remember, these are German refugees who are moving out of traditional homelands, say in Romania or the Sudeten Germans in Czechoslovakia. So what were the problems facing the Allies? We've already mentioned this to some extent. Basically, Germany is a social, political and economic chaos. German cities, on the whole, had been destroyed by Allied bombing. 75% of the buildings in Berlin had been demolished. Only 1% of the buildings in Hanover, although having said that, only 1% of Hanover was undamaged. A large number completely destroyed. Having said that, there are some German cities were not quite untouched, but certainly not devastated on that level. Communications and infrastructure being simply disrupted, roads, railway networks and bridges destroyed. And this was part of, as a result of the war, as the Germans retreated, bridges were being destroyed to try and disrupt the Allied advance. There was social chaos, old social structures disrupted, German men killed or imprisoned during the war. It's basically left up to the women to fend for themselves, and especially the problems as the Red Army marched into the east was that of revenge, and this was done through the use of rape as a form of war. Massive refugee crisis. 12 million Germans migrated from the east, plus thousands displaced within Germany, prisoners of war and concentration camp inmates. Political chaos. Remember, the Nazi state had been dismantled. There is no authority whatsoever, no administration. There's a need for the restoration of law and order, and the basic necessities of life had to be restored: gas, electricity, water, food supplies and housing. So what was to be done? Well, the next conference was the key to this. Potsdam is a small city just outside of Berlin, and it was in the Soviet zone. It started in July and finished in August, and this was a slightly different feel to it. One, because Roosevelt had died before the end of the Second World War, the American president, and been taken over, and his place being taken over by Truman. Truman was a lot more suspicious of Stalin than Roosevelt. And also, halfway through the conference, there was a British general election. Winston Churchill, amazingly, was voted out, and the Labour Party won a landslide majority, and Clement Attlee became Prime Minister. Then there you can see him there. And this is where they agreed the 4 Ds, and that the Allies would administer the different zones. Reparations in kind rather than cash. Each power authorised to seize goods from their own zone. Having said that, though, the USSR was to get 50% of the total amount from other places as well. This was going to cause some consternation later on. All decisions were to be taken collegially within the Allied Control Council, made up of the 4 winning allies, and these were temporary measures pending a formal peace conference, which of course never actually happened. So what happened in the different zones? In the Soviet zone, there was what was called a gradualist approach, basically creeping Sovietization, although it was not meant to be a complete carbon copy of the USSR. Having said that, there was a lack of planning, mainly because there was some factions. Some, like Beria within the Politburo, basically wanted to take as much as they can from Germany. Others saw reconstruction being a better method of dealing with what was happening in Germany. Mass rapes alienated the German population, not just the women, but obviously the men as well. One of the key things, though, that did gain some support was the nationalisation of industry. 77% support there, as you can see, but with dismantling of 30% of the factories was unpopular. Dismantling, of course, meant that they were being taken across to the Soviet Union. There was land reform, which is popular among farmers. Basically, this was the land was being taken off the larger Junker estates, basically the the landed gentry and was given to the farmers, but they were made into much larger farms. The refugees, USSR mainly blamed for the inhuman treatment.